Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with James Carlyle and Cais Manai. Cais and James have both spent a number of years working at R3 on their Corda platform before last year switching their focus to work on the Obscuro Network. The Obscuro Network is a privacy-first Ethereum Layer 2 network. Some of the topics we covered included how the Obscuro Network came to be, the approach it is taking with respect to blockchain privacy versus some of the other layer 2 solutions out there, and some of the challenges they will need to overcome when they're being privacy first. I found this conversation not just to be a fantastic primer on the Obscuro network itself and its approach to privacy, but also very helpful to understand some of the limitations in many of the zero knowledge proof-based layer 2 networks we hear a lot about, and I'm sure you'll have many similar takeaways too. James and Cais, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast today. You've both been involved in the DLT industry for some time now, and a lot of that time was focused on Corda. Now you're working on Obscuro. What is it and how did it come to be?
I'll let you take that. Thanks, Cais. So I'm James. Obscuro is, I guess, an idea that came out. We started looking at DeFi last summer. We actually both have been heads down in the permission blockchain space for the last 6 years, building Corda. And we were, of course, aware of DeFi, but I was involved in the Ethereum community back in 2015. I was a huge Ethereum evangelist while I was working at Barclays, and I think it was a surprise to me how much it had changed. And because we were so heads down, we weren't in some ways we weren't really paying attention to what was happening in the permissionless space. So we looked around, we saw DeFi, and I think one of the things we observed was that one of the technologies that we'd been working on inside R3, which is the confidential computing technology, it could be taken and it could be used to provide some degree of privacy for smart contract execution. And in fact, the initial concept was simply take encrypted data, use Ethereum or another permissionless blockchain as a storage availability capability and engine, effectively decrypt it within an execution environment that was confidential, and then place the result back on public ledger. So it was, and in fact, very early on, we were thinking about using IPFS as a storage mechanism. We weren't thinking necessarily of Ethereum per se, but what would it take to construct a mechanism where you had information available in public, but it was encrypted and it was only processed in an encrypted form. That was the genesis of it.
And so you've written a white paper and you've assembled an initial team to work on it, and I presume you're kind of in heads down building phase right now.
Yeah, we're in an interesting phase where we have a white paper. We've got quite a lot of feedback on the white paper, but we're always looking for more feedback. The white paper describes the protocol. How is it possible to encrypt smart contract state? How is it possible to use an existing public permissionless blockchain infrastructure to store that state? How is it possible to turn a network into something that's permissionless, where anyone can deploy a contract, and preferably an existing contract that an existing Ethereum compatible contract can be simply redeployed onto a different network, an L2 network. Maybe we'll talk about L1 and L2 a little bit for listeners that aren't familiar with those terms. And then, how to enable a collection of these L2 nodes to cooperate and process transactions in a way that outside observers can't see what's happening. That's really the challenge. So the white paper's out there. We're always looking for feedback on it. What are we doing at the moment is prototyping some of the technology.
And with respect to the all of your work with Corda there, it was quite heavily focused on the enterprise side of things. And when you started off with the bureau and well, the idea for it, were you thinking about it more from the perspective of enterprises? I know on the website you talk about things like KYC, dark pools, and some of these more established things that financial firms certainly have a lot of challenges with respect to public blockchain technologies. And so was that kind of a key part of the thinking? And then you sort of had a wider revelation, hey, this could work for just general public blockchain infrastructure, and anyone could potentially want to use this.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm sure Case will talk some more about the use cases, but I think yes, we've got a corporate background, and for Corda, one of the focus areas, one of the big differentiators for it was that it employed a sort of point-to-point transaction mechanism, and data was only shared on a need-to-know basis. So the prime driver for that for Corda was privacy, and commercial transactions need privacy. This is our belief. I don't think anyone would dispute that. There's a lot of commercially sensitive information that when companies are dealing with each other, they don't want revealed because it undermines their negotiating position, for example. Yes, but then we got into this wider thing. Well, if we can encrypt the ledger and keep transactions confidential, would that have any kind of meaning for let's say retail use cases? And there's a much wider movement of people who believe that privacy is a right. The argument that, well, I don't need privacy because I've got nothing to hide, it completely misses the point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've got something which is so in terms of sort of like Web 3.0 privacy matters. It's why it's interesting is because so in the cypherpunks manifesto, kind of where it all started, predating Bitcoin, it has in one of its opening paragraphs that privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. It goes on to say privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. So it's almost like privacy is this sort of foundational part of this whole movement. And I think for a long time it was okay to kind of say, well, you obtain privacy by being anonymous, and then you're sort of pseudo-anonymous. And now it's kind of like, well, okay, now there's so much data out there and there's so many transactions, and pretty much everyone's on-ramp or off-ramp into this space is via some centralized exchange or via some fiat mechanism. That I don't think that truly holds any longer. I don't think, it's rare that you're truly anonymous now with just that mechanism in place. As well as, just, I guess, sort of privacy in solving use cases. So perhaps where it's not even, important for the end users to have privacy, but rather for the whole solution to be effective, it requires privacy. And the one I talked about on the Discord AMA was Constitution DAO, right? Which was, for anyone that doesn't know, it was this, I guess, sort of almost audacious attempt to have a DAO own a copy of, I think it was one of the last remaining printed copies of the US Constitution. So the idea was to kind of, in a sense, give it back to the people by having people collectively buy it through this DAO. So, everyone got together and collected, I think it was, in excess of $35 million. And the idea was to turn up at Sotheby's and, bid through this DAO and buy this copy and then kind of collectively decide what to do with it. But where it fell short was that there was no privacy. So everything was out in the open. And when Privacy DAO, turned up, well, everyone could see what Privacy DAO's maximum bid could be, right? So if you're, Ken Griffin and you're watching this unfold, well, you can say, well, perhaps Constitution DAO is our biggest competitor in this auction. That's my competition right there. And I know exactly what they're willing to bid up to. So I'm going to, mobilize these funds or whatever it is. And, you're at an advantage if you know what your competition's willing to bid, right? So, just there, I think it's a nice sort of topical, easy to understand use case where with privacy, the outcome could have been vastly different.
Absolutely, and I think you raise a very key point there about tying in with the cyberpunk movement, but also more generally about how privacy should be much higher up on people's expectations with regards to these different platforms. I think that there's one area which it's kind of the whole idea of where DAOs are going, and this is around when if you think of them in terms of companies, and this is an example I come back to when if I consider myself as a business owner, I have annual reporting obligations. Public companies have, of course, got public reporting obligations and so on. And in those sorts of areas, it's probably one of the few areas where it does make sense to be able to have not everything out in the open, but certainly the current model sort of works there. But as you say, though, in the vast majority of use cases, this information asymmetry is often a good thing when there's any sort of competitive pressures at play there.
Yeah, I think the other thing is when we think about Ethereum as a platform, permissionless network, how might it be affecting our lives in future, in 5 or 10 years time? And for as long as it remains a fairly sort of niche ecosystem and relatively small numbers of participants, maybe the privacy thing is less important. But for it to reach sort of mass adoption, for people to start to live their lives using platforms like Ethereum, then the question about privacy becomes much more significant. And this isn't strictly comparable, but the ECB, the European Central Bank, did a survey of citizens living in Europe about what features a digital euro had to have for them to feel comfortable using it. And 60% of the respondents said that privacy mattered, was the most important thing for them in using a digital euro. And so I think we can probably extrapolate from that and say, well, if people are going to live their lives with these platforms, it's akin to asking the question, would you be happy for your neighbors to see your bank transactions? Or not just your neighbors, but people maybe you had an axe to grind. Maybe they didn't like you. Would you be happy for them to understand exactly what you spend your money on or how much you earn? And I think we reason, if Ethereum as a broader platform is going to spread beyond even the existing applications to be, the bank account of someone's life in future, then privacy does matter.
Yeah, and even in today's physical world, the fact that letters are delivered in envelopes and that you shouldn't be looking in letters to other people that's a great example of what's at stake there, because we're all very acutely aware of all of the fraud and so on that can take place when people can access this private information about other people.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, we talk about DAOs and governance, and then we started to touch on governance of institutions currently. But a key question, for example, is should people be able to know how you voted on something? And we're seeing, I think we're seeing DAOs move towards a unified model where a lot of decisions are put forward by the community members as proposals and then voted upon. Is that something that people should be able to see? Because, of course, in a real world, votes are kept confidential. That's why we have privacy booths at voting stations.
Yeah, and it's something that's very, very topical this week with what happened in the ENS project a couple of days ago, for instance, where one of the key team members was ousted as a result of what they'd tweeted previously in the past. And in these sorts of sensitive areas, which in the world of DAOs is they've not really, I think, had these sorts of problems before, but it starts to really highlight why, as you say, the need for privacy around how people are voting and so on, because these can be quite divisive topics, and do you really want to know, where what people's beliefs are, who you thought maybe leaning, in a different sort of way to what you thought.
Yeah, well, I followed the let's say that ENS governance newsworthy item moderately closely. I was reading some of the replies, I suppose the reality, and I've always felt this with DeFi as well, is that when there's a small group of pioneers, um, everyone is prepared to put their name to their vote or their name to their actions. Everyone who has an ENS name, for example, in many cases, they are linking their name to their NFT purchases and everything else they do. So the pioneers, I think, are comfortable with a lack of privacy. It's just they're pioneers. They're leading the way. They're providing thought leadership. They want people to see what they're doing. But it's the mass majority that follows that for whom privacy is going to be more important.
Absolutely. And so going back to Obscuro in terms of the approach that you're taking there. So you mentioned the conclave technology, which Corda released, was it last year or the year before, which makes use of these trusted execution environments, which are really hardware enclaves for data that Intel have on some of their CPUs. What How does this sort of approach differ to some of the other types of approaches that people and projects are using for privacy with respect to blockchains? Of course, zero knowledge proof comes up a lot. And I know, Cais, recently you wrote about the privacy trilemma as well. It'd be great to kind of expand a little bit more on this.
So the privacy trilemma, well, the 3 points are programmability. So that's the ability to carry out, general purpose Turing complete computations. The second is decentralization, and the third is privacy. And the case I was making is that achieving all three is really difficult. Not many technologies can achieve all three. In fact, the case I'm actually building is that Obscuro and other projects that use trusted execution environments are the only available solutions today. Keep it being today, because things are really fast moving and ZKPs are getting better all the time. But right now, that's the case. And I think there are some misconceptions around sort of what ZKPs can do, right? That need to be sort of, I guess, cleared up. So one being that ZKPs are automatic providers of privacy, and yes, they might be, but it kind of depends on the application. So let's think about some of the really popular L2 rollups. So let's think about StarkX or ZK Sync and what they do. So often people say, oh wow, so they use ZKP, so they must be private, and that's not the case. That's not what they're solving for, right? Something like ZK Sync is actually solving for scalability. What they do is you go onto their L2 and you carry out transactions really, they're really cheap and they're fast, and they have this centralized sequencer that collects all these transactions, aggregates them together, produces a ZKP, and then publishes that to the L1 as a rollup. And they're taking advantage of the fact that it's actually pretty cheap to verify a ZKP versus creating one. And that's what they're really doing. They're kind of solving the scalability problem. So then you need to look to perhaps other solutions out there which are trying to solve privacy with ZKPs, and those are super interesting. So something like Aztec Network is a really interesting project, and they're doing some amazing work. But fundamentally, what it comes down to ultimately is that it's very, very hard to combine ZKPs and privacy with an account-based model. The only way you can have ZKPs plus privacy is if you sort of revert back to a UTXO model, right? Which is, if you sort of think about, if you try and build a mental image of what a UTXO model is, it's an account-based system. Every account has a balance, right? And everyone kind of operates, on that balance. Whereas with a UTXO system, it's kind of flipped, and it's every state or every note has an owner, right? So it's more like sort of like a DAG in that sense. You have all these, notes or states, and they have owners. And that's a lot more easier to reason about, because now what you're trying to do as sort of a collective network is solve a much simpler problem, which is, can I ensure nobody's double spending these states? That's all I really need to do. I don't need to know what the values are inside these states. I don't really need to know who's involved. All I need to know is has this state been spent before? Yes. Okay, that's rejected, or no, that can go ahead. And so that's sort of the foundational problem you need to solve. And I guess the other is, you want to prevent people from printing money out of thin air, right? So if it's, if I'm transferring a token, 10 tokens, you want to ensure that that output state is not 20 tokens. And the way you do that is, that's where the ZKP comes in, right? You create a ZKP, and what that ZKP is proving is that you did the computation correctly, i.e., A plus B equals C plus D, right? If you had sort of two input states and two output states. And, you generate that locally. So you generate a ZKP, and you kind of broadcast that to the network, and you can kind of say, look, I haven't double spent. You guys, can verify that at least. And here's the ZKP to prove that I did the computation correctly. As long as you guys can verify that, then, you should be happy with this, updated state of the world, or this sort of transfer of, UTXO from states from here to here. And that's kind of, if you look at any ZKP-based solution today, and I'd love to be proven wrong, but right now, everything decomposes into UTXO. I don't think I've seen a single one where it's claiming otherwise. And that, I think, is, the problem with ZKPs, and why they're not sort of, at this point, ready, because you can't sort of, have DeFi, for example, or you can't have it easily, at least, in a UTXO centric model, right? So there are sort of like, for example, Aztec are doing some really cool stuff where they're allowing users to go from, this UTXO model layer 2 and interact with a layer 1 DeFi contract. And it's super smart what they've done. But all you can really do is kind of obfuscate or hide the identities of who's now interacting with that L1 contract. But that L1 contract is still out in the open. So you haven't sort of solved privacy for that L1 contract as a whole. So if we imagine that being Constitution DAO, that wouldn't have solved the problem of Constitution DAO keeping their balance private. It will have solved the problem of, we don't know who's contributing. So it's kind of hard to sort of like, to explain. I am doing another blog post to follow up to the Trilemma, which kind of, explains all this out, better than I can now. But essentially, that's kind of, why we think it's not ZKPs. ZKPs plus privacy, for now, equals UTXO. and that's where we're at. And I think, but with TEEs, if you think about, trying to sort of build a mental model, rationalize or rationalize about that, it's kind of, you can take an entire contract and deploy that to an instance of the EVM running inside a trusted execution environment. So it's completely sealed. It's a complete black box. And obviously you can, run attestation against it to ensure that, it's running what you expect it to run. But at that point, it's not sort of just the input values and the output values that are encrypted, but it's the entire processing, if that makes sense. So, if you had like a simple options contract, you could sort of argue, well, if we encrypt the inputs and outputs, we've got a completely private options contract. But at the point of exercise, even if those inputs and outputs are hidden, someone can see you exercise. Someone can see you, make that function call and say, right, I can now see you've exercised this option. But in Obscuro, even something like that would be entirely hidden away, because you'd never be able to see, what's being called within that black box. So we kind of think of it as, it's sort of true privacy, and it's available now. So it kind of made total sense for us to, to leverage the technology. And I think Emin Gul, that's his name, right? Of Avalanche makes this. He did this interview, and I can't really sort of like make the same arguments he made, because he's an academic, and he can sort of, sort of say, well, other academics are wrong, and I feel I can. But he was making the case that academics just love to tie both hands behind their backs and then try and solve problems. And what they really hate is when someone comes up with something simple like a hardware solution, which kind of negates sort of decades of this, really intense cryptographic research, and says, well, look, here you go. We've now got this little chip that can solve that problem for you. And it's like, it's almost nihilistic. It's like, well, no, that can't be good enough. And, it'll constantly be attacked. But, what if it is good enough? And what if that's it? That's now solved the problem.
Yeah, so when hearing you articulated in terms of the broader context there, I mean, it certainly has those aspects of, it sounds like quite an obvious solution in hindsight, of course, to this problem there. And in terms of within the Ethereum ecosystem, are there other companies looking at this? So from what I understand, there are some others doing similar things on different layer one networks.
Yeah, I don't believe there are others who are targeting the Ethereum ecosystem at this point. So we should give a shout out to Secret Network, which is doing something similar for the Cosmos network, Cosmos ecosystem. Um, just a couple. I'm going to take argument with Cais a little bit. I mean, I think um, we're sort of pragmatists, and trusted execution environment based confidential computing works now. It's got a, let's say, at least a 6-year history with Intel and other chip manufacturers building chips with this capability. I think a mathematics based approach, in the long term, is probably better, because the question is, who do you trust? Do you trust the mathematics? And some of the mathematics is really new and unproven, and the mathematics at the moment also doesn't necessarily perform. It's computationally expensive. Or are you prepared to trust a chip manufacturer? How, would you be better trusting multiple chip manufacturers so you're not dependent on one only? Um, and how can you swap out your hardware-based solution for a mathematics-based solution in future? These some of the things we're thinking about, and I think it's my preference that we are able to do that. That we can, at the point that, for example, fully homomorphic encryption is available and performant, and allows for general-purpose smart contract execution. That's the point at which we'd probably want to swap out potentially a hardware-based approach for a mathematics-based approach.
It's certainly one of those things as well that some members of the Ethereum community, with the criticisms they levy at things like Solana and Avalanche, they argue that um, they're sacrificing decentralization with software at the expense of having more powerful hardware, and it's certainly fascinating to see kind of how those layer one wars play out as such. But like you say, it's you kind of got to be pragmatic as well about this. It's not like with the internet you can take encryption for granted when you're communicating using HTTP and so on. Whereas we're not kind of at that place yet with this Web3 world.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'd say there is, in terms of accessibility, the intention with Obscuro is that because these chips are widely available, and they're widely available both on server-based and cloud-based machines, and because the performance overhead of doing the confidential computing is potentially a few tens of percent, we get almost native, CPU performance while we're keeping stuff confidential. The hardware requirements for running a node on Obscuro Network should be relatively low. So of the same order of magnitude as, for example, running an Ethereum client node, but not so. This idea that that Ethereum promotes still is that you can have a very democratic and broad node operator base for Ethereum because the requirements are low. That's something we intend to maintain.
Yeah, that's good to hear that, and I'm sure there's many members of the community that will like to hear that point as well. So let's just talk about the roadmap as well with regard to Obscuro. I know we touched on where you are right now, but there's no doubt down the line going to be a network launch, and then you have a token associated with it as well, and you have your intent. You don't call them miners, you call them aggregators that on the network. Where are we kind of with respect to it being a live thing that's out there?
So there's a number of things at play here. The first is, as a project team, we have been funded by R3, the company that developed Corda. I guess the technology the culture, the target market, and so on is different from the enterprise blockchain space that R3 is in with Corda. And so for that reason, it's appropriate to spin this out from R3 and start it as a separate project. So but we're very much made of R3, if that makes sense. We have that sort of we're mixing a culture that's part corporate. We care about regulation, and we care about what the regulator thinks, and we care about laws, and we follow them. We want clarity around laws and regulations to make it easy to follow. But at the same time, we're also community focused. So we're starting to build the Obscuro community. It's one of those sort of good morning, Buenos Dias type communities. That's what we think is going to be most effective at building it in a collaborative way, building it in a way that people that would deploy onto it are aware of what we're doing very early on, so they can start to think about whether privacy matters to their applications. And we want to build it as a wider collective. We don't want this sort of us and them mentality that sometimes exists in these projects and also in the commercial software space. So one of the things we've got, for example, on our wiki page, which is open, is a list of tasks that community members can start to get involved with, so that there isn't this core team and then there's sort of a barrier or a wall and then there's everyone else. We don't want that at all. We are interested in using a token to power the network because we want the network to be decentralized. We want anyone to be able to run an aggregator node and to be rewarded for doing so in terms of fees that are paid by users. So there's a transfer of value from people that are using the applications to people that are running the infrastructure. And we want anyone to be able to do that. That's the reason for having a token, but it's a utility token. And that means, we can only create it at the point that it has utility, at the point there is a network. So one of the things we want to get to is an alpha production network really as quickly as possible. And then we can start to provide, a reason for having a utility token. And of course, because we're pragmatists and we're engineers, we're looking at not so much original research into things like homomorphic encryption, some of that hard mathematics that we were talking about earlier, but we're looking at how can we focus on one thing and then I think really to the greatest extent possible reuse all of the good work that's been done already, both in terms of potentially software libraries, use the open source software to its fullest extent. And I'm talking about things like Geth. We're developing prototyping at the moment in Go, so we don't want to write our own EVM. That doesn't make sense. We've taken a good look at Geth's EVM. But also not just software, also community matters as well. Is there a playbook for how to engage the community? Is there a playbook for how to reward the community? We do, I suppose, want to live the future in terms of thinking about a foundation and a DAO, but we also want to learn from what others are doing in that space.
So it's definitely, it seems to be a good approach to actually build a strong community around it and have these kind of clear trajectory for the long run. And so thinking about the use cases on the website, you talk about maximal extractionable value, auctions, dark pools, KYC gaming, and NFTs. At this point, now that you've had more time to kind of focus on the network, are there which of those, or maybe it's other areas, are kind of the ones that are most exciting to you around this?
The objective is to be able to allow anyone with a contract to deploy it onto a confidential execution platform without changing it. So rather than think, okay, well, we're going to develop 2 or 3 or a small number of use cases, it's almost the other way around. A much wider set of applications that currently exist, would they benefit from privacy? One of the considerations is that I think it's not perhaps quite as simple as simply redeploying onto a confidential platform, the way the contract works may need to be rethought. So, which aspects must remain private? Conversely, if you've got privacy by default, which aspects of the contract should you explicitly make public? Because there'll be a sense, I think, in which people say, well, if everything is opaque, then it's maybe the contract doesn't work anymore. Some information has to be made public for people ultimately to want to interact with it in the first place. Then there's a second question. If it's completely opaque, how can people be sure that it's working properly, working as intended, working as designed and specified? That's a slightly easier question to answer because it's going to be possible to prove that the contract that's running is this derived from or compiled from the source code that's visible. So you can check the source code even if you can't see the internal state of the contract. And then, so there's definitely a wide range of existing applications for which privacy is clearly not mandatory, otherwise they wouldn't exist today, but uptake may be limited because they're not private. There's another set of applications for which don't even exist on permissionless blockchain systems like Ethereum today because privacy is critical. And so no one has bothered building those applications. It doesn't make sense to build them if everyone can see everything. So I think a lot of corporate use cases fall into that latter category. Corporates don't want others to see their transactions with their counterparties. So for the time being, it's never made sense to deploy those onto permissionless blockchains.
And as you say, it kind of comes back to the community angle too, because if you've got a big community on the platform, then they're going to experiment and come up with all sorts of crazy and great ideas, probably in equal measure that you wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, I think they will. I mean, I think there's a lot of important questions that remain unanswered about privacy's good, yes, but is complete privacy necessary? Is it actually important that it's not completely private, conversely, so that people get a sense of how the application itself is working? I mean, if I can just give an example, one of the things I'm looking at the moment is the simplest possible thing. It's an auction. So you can submit bids into an auction, and maybe with an auction on Ethereum at the moment, everyone can see all of the bids and who bid what. Now, maybe with an auction on Obscuro, you can't see who's bid what, but maybe you do want to see the number of bids. Maybe that's something that should be public. So that's the kind of information where perhaps people need to think through, well, what does privacy mean in this context? And so there's that angle. There's another angle which we spent a bit of time thinking about as a team, which is around regulation. Is regulation coming to DeFi, for example? We think it is. I mean, my belief is that DeFi is going to sort of bifurcate into sort of a regulated half or three quarters, and then a Wild West unregulated part, which simply seeks to innovate and wants to stay ahead of that regulation. But how do regulators feel about privacy technology? And there's a tough question there. Actually, the question I think a lot of privacy technology platforms fail to answer. They say, well, we can't see what's going on, and so it's none of our business. And if it's being used for criminal purposes, there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, my personal belief is that's not really acceptable. There is something you can do about it. You just chose not to do anything about it. But it's a question I think that every software developer who's working with privacy technology does need to think about.
Yeah, and with the examples of what's happened with Apple in the previous years around their privacy policies and the US government there's certainly been some interesting differences of opinion with it all.
Yeah, I think people like the benefits of privacy, and they want it for themselves. if you said to them, well, if there's a price to pay in terms of criminal activity, can you live with it? Most people would say, well, as long as the benefits outweigh the costs, yes, we can live with it. But I think we can take a slightly more nuanced view than that. We can say, well, and it's one of the things we argue in the white paper, that privacy has a time dimension. The value of privacy is greatest immediately after the event, and then declines over time. And for different use cases, that decrease in value of privacy can be very rapid. I mean, we talked about MEV, maximal extractable value. That privacy is only valuable really for the duration of the block formation, so potentially 15 seconds or so. Something like a commercial transaction, maybe that privacy is valuable for a year, but after a year it becomes merely of historical interest because the world's moved on anyway. State secrecy. In the UK, there's a statute that says that state secrets should be revealed after 20 years. So that's really the upper limit of privacy. But I think, and one of the things in the white paper is a design for allowing developers to determine the length of privacy that should apply for their particular use case. But saying ultimately, law enforcement agencies will have visibility. Transaction privacy is not infinite. There ultimately will be law enforcement visibility, and therefore we're trying to set a disincentive for criminals to use this platform, essentially, by saying you can't hide forever.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating point as well, the notion of privacy decay, so to speak. Okay, so just as we wrap up here, in terms of you've mentioned, of course, that you're very keen to grow the community around around Obscuro. We will link to the website with the show notes of the podcast. But also, if people want to get involved, where would you encourage them to start? Is it reading the white paper? And also, if people want to actually reach out to the team or have questions for you guys, what are the mediums that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I think reading the white paper is a good start. There's an FAQ up there as well, which is a bit more easily digestible. But otherwise, Discord, Telegram, particularly Discord, and we're very active on Discord. We're on all the time. Love engaging with the community. Love taking questions. We'll be hosting another AMA again soon. Those are probably the best ways. Anything I've missed?
Well, we've got to get the domain name out there. So it's obscure.ro is the website. And then our handles are obscuronet on Twitter, Discord, and Telegram. And the reason for that is we want, I guess, the same handle across all these platforms, and that's available. The Obscuro is actually I think it's a Spanish word. It's a legitimate word in its own right. So there are lots of Obscuros, but there's only one Obscuro net.
There's a reference to Harry Potter in there as well, I understand too.
There is, I believe, Obscuro is a spell in Harry Potter land.
Is it an invisibility spell?
Well, it's to cover the eyes of the person you're casting the spell against.
Pure coincidence, of course.
Pure coincidence. The community is really at the heart of it. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's actually the most exciting bit, or one of the most exciting bits, is trying to make this a whole effort rather than just simply the effort of a small team.
Yeah, it was a very different way of doing it. Well, James and Cais, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you both today, and I look forward to watching the Obscuro network grow into not being so obscure and being something that everyone talks about.
Great. Thank you very much, Conor, for having us. It's been fantastic.
Thanks, Conor.
Right. Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.